The midwife's breath turned blue before sunrise. She had come to deliver a child beneath a low smoke hole in a lodge pitched too tightly against the wind. The mother survived. The baby did too. But the woman who had brought more than 30 lives into the world didn't walk back out. By the time they found her body, folded like a sleeping fawn near the wall, her lungs were blackened with soot. They said she'd sealed the flaps too tight in fear of the storm. They said the fire betrayed her. But Wakenya said nothing. He had heard her coughing that night through the snow. The kind of coughing that clutches the ribs and drags them inward. He had crouched near his own fire, feeding it with care, not just wood, but breath and placement and respect. He watched how the smoke moved, not just up but sideways, eddying near the seams of the lodge. He pressed his fingers to the ground and felt how heat lingered in the soil longer than in the air. These were the kinds of things no one else seemed to notice anymore. Wakenya was not a warrior. He had not earned feathers through battle, nor songs through hunting. But he was a watcher. A son of the healer, a brother to one who had once outrun wolves, and a man who remembered what the old ones used to say, fire is not a thing to command, it is a thing to listen to. That winter had come earlier than expected, the first snow curling over the hills like a predator that didn't need to rush. By the 4th moon, 3 elders had frozen in their sleep. A child died from a spark that caught dry reeds near the bedding. And now the midwife, who had walked through storms to catch babies into this world, had died trying to keep out the same cold that had once kissed her forehead as a blessing. Something was wrong. Not just with the fire, but with how they had forgotten to build for it. That night, Wakenya sat by the embers long after the others had crawled beneath their hides. He dug into the frozen earth with a rounded stick, carved a small trench below where the fire rested. He watched the way the last heat from the logs settled low, not high. He leaned over the center of the coals, not close enough to burn, but enough to listen, and the fire did speak. It whispered not in words, but in direction, downward. Wakenya's breath fogged into the cold, trailing off in silence. Then he picked up the stick again and dug deeper. He was not yet trying to invent something. He was only trying to answer the fire's quiet cry. And in that silence, a secret began to form, one that would one day keep the people alive, not just through cold, but through time itself. They say the fire can bring visions if you know how to stare without blinking. Not the kind of visions that make you shake or speak in tongues, the other kind. The ones that arrive like memory from before you were born. Wakenya did not speak of spirits lightly, but that night the flame spoke to something deeper than his eyes. He was half asleep, chin resting on his knees, when the shapes began to form in the coals, not animals, not ancestors, but patterns. The embers shifted in waves, revealing a body beneath the fire. A breathing body. Not of flesh, but of design. A hollow space. A narrow trench running from one edge of the lodge to the other. Heat moving downward, not upward. Stones placed in a crescent, catching warmth, holding it, then releasing it slowly. He didn't move. He didn't blink. The shapes faded, but the impression stayed. When the morning came, he didn't speak to his brother. He didn't gather wood like the others. He returned to the same fire pit, swept away the ash, and began carving the pattern he had seen, a shallow channel beneath the hearth, curving toward the back wall of the lodge. He placed stones inside, flat ones from the river, each warmed by his hand before it found its place. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. That the coals had shown him what the people had forgotten. 2 boys came by and laughed. "He's building a den for mice," one said, "or maybe a grave for that stick he always carries." Wakenya ignored them. He was not building for them. He was building for the cold that would not arrive for 2 more moons, but would come all the same. The healer, his father, passed by in silence. He said nothing at first, only watching. But as the trench deepened and the stone floor grew, he finally spoke. "That's not how my father taught me to place fire." Wakenya stood and wiped soil from his palms. "Your father didn't lose a midwife to smoke." The healer narrowed his eyes but said no more. He left him to the dirt. That night, Wakenya laid a small fire atop the stones. Just pine, nothing special. But as it burned, something shifted. The smoke rose not in swirls, but in a clean, steady line through the center of the lodge. The air stayed warmer near the ground. and when he pressed his hand to the floor beside the stones, he felt warmth long after the flames had died. It was small, subtle, but it was the first time in memory that fire had warmed from below, not above. That night he dreamed again, but this time it wasn't in the coals, it was in the silence. And in that silence the old ways stirred, asking not to be remembered, but rebuilt. By the next moon, everyone had heard about Wakenya's strange digging. The children whispered it first, then the hunters, then the old women by the drying racks. Word travels fast in a village where food is scarce and laughter is cheaper than firewood. They called his lodge the Burrow, saying he meant to live like a mole. Even the dogs seemed to stare longer at his doorway, waiting for the earth to breathe him back out. When the council of elders met to prepare for the coming snows, Wakenya was asked to explain himself. They sat in a half-circle, the fire between them, their faces carved with age and smoke. His father sat among them, silent but uneasy. The head elder, a man whose hair was as white as the frost on pine, began with patience. "We have heard," he said, "that you dig tunnels beneath your lodge. We have heard you build fires in holes. Are you trying to burn the ground now?" A few chuckles rippled around the fire. Wakenya met their eyes. "The fire wants to breathe," he said simply. "We build too tight. The smoke turns angry, and it takes its revenge inside our lungs." The council exchanged glances. "The fire has no feelings," said another. "It is a servant, not a spirit. Feed it, and it serves. Starve it, and it dies." Wakenya shook his head. "Then why does it live when everything else is dead?" The laughter stopped. The white-haired elder leaned forward. "You speak like your mother. Too much of the dream in your tongue, not enough of the hunt." He pointed toward the northern lodges. "Build the way the ancestors did. Their fires kept them alive long before your trench." But that night, a different sound carried through camp, the coughing of a young child, raw and deep. Smoke poured from the top of one lodge so thick it looked like the sky itself had caught fire. Inside, a mother held her baby close, fanning the air desperately as the smoke stung her eyes. The flaps were sealed too tightly against the wind. By morning, the coughing had stopped. So had the baby's breath. No one spoke of it. They buried the child quietly in the snow. Wakenya watched from a distance, hands trembling but not from cold. He returned to his lodge and stared into his fire pit. The trench still glowed faintly, even hours after the flames had gone out. The stones gave off steady warmth, breathing it into the air in slow, silent waves. He pressed his hand to the ground again and felt it, the living pulse of the earth carrying the memory of heat. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He only whispered to the coals, "You still remember." By the next night, he started expanding the trench deeper, wider, until it reached the base of the smoke hole. The others laughed again when they saw, calling it the Lodge of Shame. But one by one, their laughter drifted into shivers. The first frost had come early, and only Wakenya's lodge was warm enough to sleep through the night. The storm came without warning, as they often do when the sky lies. One day, the clouds were soft and white, dancing over the treetops like feathers on water. The next, the wind howled down from the northern spine, dragging snow in sideways sheets that cut like knives. The people scrambled to seal their lodges, piling hides against the flaps, binding gaps with frozen reeds. The children cried for warmth, the elders held their breath and prayed to bones buried long ago. Inside Wakenya's lodge there was no panic. The fire burned low, steady, not wild and high like the others made theirs. He had learned by now that a high fire only fed the smoke. The secret was in the stones, in the trench, in the way the cold and heat balanced each other like two old rivals forced to share a room. He placed 4 new river stones beside the coals and let them warm until they whispered. Then he lined them along the inner edge of the trench. A thin, rising current began to move through the center of the lodge, not enough to feel, but enough to guide the smoke upward with no struggle. The skin flaps near the base let in air so gently it didn't even flicker the flames. By nightfall, the wind outside was violent. Lodges trembled. 2 collapsed entirely, their center poles snapping under the weight of wet snow. Inside one, a woman broke her leg trying to crawl clear. In another, the smoke filled so quickly the family had to flee barefoot into the white. And yet, Wakenya sat cross-legged by his fire, bare hands resting on the warm ground. The walls didn't sweat with heat, nor did they tighten with smoke. The lodge felt balanced. The kind of warmth that didn't bite or flee. The kind that came from inside the earth and stayed long after the flames had died. He closed his eyes and breathed in through his nose clean air, slightly sweet from pine resin, no sting of smoke, no acrid bite of trapped breath. At midnight there came a scratching at the flap. It was a woman, teeth chattering, holding a child against her chest. She had no words, only eyes full of fear and cold. Wakenya pulled her inside without speaking. The warmth met her like a blanket. Her sobs turned to silence. By dawn, 4 more families had arrived, stumbling from their own lodges, driven out not by the snow, but by the smoke. One man carried his firestone with him. Cupped in ash, he hadn't wanted to lose the flame, but his lodge was unlivable. They gathered around Wakenya's hearth like moths that had forgotten how light felt. No one asked why his fire burned low yet warmed deep. No one asked how his lodge breathed when theirs choked. They only sat, silent, listening to the quiet roar of the wind outside and the even quieter hum of warmth around them. And for the first time, they did not laugh. They asked if he could teach them. The winter broke early that year, as if ashamed of what it had done. The snows pulled back by the second moon, revealing a land bruised and quiet. Trees cracked but still standing. Tracks in the slush where desperate feet had wandered from lodges too full of smoke. Some had made it through, some hadn't. But all had one thing in common. None of them forgot what they had seen inside Wakenya's lodge. As the sun grew strong again, the others prepared for heat, pulling back their hides, digging out the vents they had buried in snow. But something strange began to happen. While other lodges turned to ovens by midday, Wakenya's remained calm, cool even. At first, they thought he was keeping a wet hide in the doorway or that he had buried ice beneath the lodge. But when a curious boy crawled inside one afternoon and lay on the braid floor like a fox in shade, he came back running, wide-eyed. "It's cooler in there than by the stream." The elders came next, pretending not to care, but asking quiet questions. They sat inside the lodge in the heat of the 4th day, expecting smoke, expecting stuffiness. But the air flowed cleanly, gently, as if the lodge was still remembering winter. Wakenya explained it like this: "The stones remember the cold, and the trench carries the breath of the earth, not the sky. It pulls heat down, then releases it slowly when the air outside goes soft. Like a drumbeat, not loud, but steady." The healer, his father, said nothing at first, but he ran his hand along the trench stones, pressed his fingers to the dirt, and sat for a long time in silence. "This was not taught to me," he finally said, "but it feels like something I forgot, not something new. It wasn't magic, it wasn't trickery, it was rhythm. The earth has a breath," Wakenya told them, "and when you build your fire to breathe with it, you don't need to fight the seasons, you dance with them." More questions came. Could the trench be made larger? Could it warm a lodge twice the size? Could it keep meat dry in the summer or protect an infant in the night when the air turns wild? Wakenya didn't know all the answers, but he knew the stones listened, and the earth never lies. By the 6th moon, 2 more lodges had been built with the same design, deeper hearth pits, layered stone trenches, thin flaps near the floor for slow intake of air. The people began calling them breathing lodges, and for the first time the elders admitted it. The old ways may have missed something, or maybe they'd just stopped listening. Wakenya said little. He sat outside in the evening warmth, watching the smoke rise from each of the new lodges in a straight line, not choking, not drifting, but steady. The fire was finally breathing the way it had wanted to all along. He came walking from the edge of the 5th sunrise, wrapped in a tattered buffalo hide and leaning on a crooked staff carved with someone else's story. No one recognized him. His face was sunburned, his lips split from wind, and his legs shook with every step. But he did not fall. He walked straight into the village like a spirit with a purpose, not asking permission, only looking for one man. "I heard," he rasped, "that your fire breathes." They brought him to Wakenya just before dusk, when the wind turned soft and the sky looked like it had been painted in ash. The man's name was Nametka, a hunter from a river people far to the east. He had heard whispers of lodges that did not choke you, of fire that warmed without smothering, of a man who made the coals live deeper than before. Nemetka's feet were cracked and bloodied. His breath wheezed like a sick wolf. But Wakenya said nothing at first. He simply helped him inside the lodge and gave him water warmed over stone, not flame. The stranger drank slowly, then slept for a full day without waking. When he did wake, he sat silently by the trench fire for a long time. "Your flame doesn't move like ours," he said finally. "It listens." Wakenya nodded. It was never supposed to scream. Nemetka began to cough then, hard and wet. Wakenya moved quickly, placing pine resin near the stones, letting it melt and rise in the air. He laid the hunter near the center of the lodge and propped his back just above the heat line, where the air moved softest. No smothering smoke, no cold pockets, just breath. 3 days passed. Wakenya boiled herbs in stone pots and poured them slowly onto the trench rocks, filling the lodge with healing scent. He fed Nemetka broth laced with root. He spoke little. But each day the hunter's color returned, and by the 4th his cough had quieted. "My own lodge nearly took me," Nemetka said, eyes on the fire. "I sealed it against the cold, but the smoke stayed. It stayed in my good lungs. My daughter." He stopped there, and the silence said what words could not. Wakenya didn't offer comfort. He only offered a coal, gently lifted and placed in the stranger's palm. "Take this back," he said, "and don't build for the cold, build for the fire." Nemetka bowed his head. Later that evening the council asked why Wakenya had taken in a stranger when food was tight and space tighter. "He didn't come for shelter," Wakenya replied. "He came for breath." And in a village where too many had died coughing in the dark, that answer silenced all objection. When Nemetka left, he walked with strength again. He carried a drawing burned into birch bark, a simple trench, a curve of stones, a smoke hole shaped like a question, and somewhere far to the east, a second breathing lodge would rise before the next winter. The snow returned on the 7th moon, not with fury, but with silence, the kind that sinks into the bones without warning. And yet, this time the village did not fear it. The people had changed the way they built, the way they burned, the way they listened. Fires no longer roared, they whispered, smoke no longer choked, it flowed. Wakenya's lodge was no longer alone in its breath. 12 other lodges now bore trenches beneath their hearths, stones lined in crescent shapes, vents set low to the ground. Smoke holes widened near the top, shaped not like chimneys but like mouths ready to exhale. And it worked. It all worked. The old woman who had once called Wakenya a mole now visited daily, bringing boiled roots and watching the trench like it might speak. "I still don't know how it works," she confessed one morning, "but my bones don't ache like they used to. That's all I need to know." Children began to learn the rhythm of fire, not from fear, but from fascination. They'd sit near the coals and listen to the draft, the soft sigh of warmth moving through their lodges like breath through a sleeping bear. They played games placing feathers near the vent and watching which way they danced, and in doing so, they learned what the adults had forgotten. Fire is alive, and it speaks if you let it. Wakenya taught without standing tall. He did not shout or lead. He knelt beside apprentices and showed them how to carve trenches not too deep, how to choose stones that held heat, how to test airflow with smoke from a single pine needle. He taught them how to build balance, not walls against the cold, but relationships with the flame. One boy, no more than 10 winters old, asked, "Why do we bury the heat?" Wakenya smiled. "We don't bury it. We let it sleep where it can't escape too fast. The earth holds it like a mother holds a child. Then when we need it, it rises slowly, not to run, but to stay." By the 3rd snowfall, even the most stubborn hunters had admitted something had changed. Food dried better, hides cured faster. Sickness came less often, and when it did, it passed, quicker. The healer, Wakenya's father, now walked with him, asking questions in a low voice and nodding as the answers came. "I tried to fight the fire before," he admitted one night. "You taught me to befriend it." And still, Wakenya did not claim credit. He said only that the fire had been trying to teach them all along, they had simply stopped listening. The breath of the earth had returned to the people, and in the center of each lodge the fire didn't just burn, it taught, it was not announced. There was no drumbeat, no feast, just a quiet realization, as spring crept over the hills like a mother returning home. No one had died. No infants suffocated in smoke. No elders froze in their sleep. No women miscarried from the sting of cold or poison in the lungs. The healer noticed first. He kept the counts not just of births and deaths, but of coughs, of fevers, of how many times he had been called to a lodge in the middle of the night. That year, the number was nearly none. And what changed? Only the way they built their fire. The people began to say the fire had grown gentle, but Wakenya knew the truth. It had always been gentle. They were the ones who'd handled it like a beast instead of a brother. The air in the village shifted. Where once every family had hoarded wood like gold, now they used half as much. Where once the elders had stayed curled near the hearth, coughing into their hands, now they walked the paths again, even in snow. Children no longer feared the flames. They helped feed them slow and careful, like feeding an elder who could still bite if provoked. One woman, who had lost her first child to a winter storm the year before, gave birth inside a breathing lodge under the moon of melting ice. The midwife emerged afterward, smiling, her hands warm. "I did not need to fan the smoke even once," she said. "It left on its own." There was joy, yes, but also grief, not for the present, but for the past. The people began to speak in hushed voices about those they had lost before Wakenya's trench was ever dug. Infants, elders, mothers, all gone to fires that did not breathe right. They had not died of cold or smoke, not truly. They had died because the people had forgotten how to build with respect. Wakenya sat by the river one evening, shaping a stone with his knife when his father joined him. The healer had grown thin that winter, but strong in the eyes. "You know," he said, "we used to think the fire was dangerous." "It still is," Wakenya replied, "but now we know how to speak to it." The healer nodded. "This year, no burials, not one." They sat in silence as frogs began to sing nearby, and a breeze carried the smell of pine ash from a distant hearth. "That smell," the healer said softly, "used to mean sorrow. Now it smells like peace." And though Wakenya said nothing, he felt it too, the quiet triumph of a people who had remembered something they'd never been taught. Not a miracle, not magic, just listening. The year without death would be remembered long after the fire that taught it had gone cold. And in every lodge that now breathed with the earth, a lesson still pulsed in the stones: survive first, and then remember why. It was the 12th moon when the raiders came, not a full war party, but 5 men from a starving band to the north, driven mad by hunger and bitterness. They struck just before dawn, when the sky is gray and the air feels like it forgot how to breathe. No drums, no calls, just quiet feet and sharpened bone knives. They found nothing. No smoke. No sound. No silhouettes of fires burning high in the night. They passed the first few lodges like ghosts through trees, expecting warmth, light, noise, but the village slept, hidden not by distance, but by silence. The breathing lodges did not scream with fire. Their smoke did not rise like signals. It flowed through smoke holes that whispered instead of shouted. A trickle of air, a curl of ash. Nothing that gave away life to eyes sharpened by hunger. One of the raiders cursed. "Where are they?" Another crouched, touched the earth. It was warm, too warm. Before they could speak again, they were spotted. Not by a sentry, but by a boy retrieving kindling from beneath his family's stacked hides. He didn't run. He simply looked calm, unmoving, unafraid. And that stillness was the alarm. Within moments, the village stirred. Doors did not slam open. Fires were not stoked, but bodies moved from the lodges, quietly, as if they had always been awake, because they had been. Sleeping inside a breathing lodge was not like sleeping under the old roofs. The cold didn't lull you. The smoke didn't blur your dreams. You slept like the earth itself, aware, slow to rise, but impossible to surprise. The raiders fled. They weren't chased. They didn't need to be. They had seen something they couldn't understand. Later that day, the council gathered not in panic, but in thought. One elder said, "Our warmth no longer betrays us." Another nodded, "The fire hides us now, like mist." Wakenya said nothing. He was walking the perimeter of the village, studying the curve of the wind. In his hands he carried a new idea, a carved funnel of bark, fitted to a vent, allowing the air to twist softly in and out without stirring the skins. When he returned, the healer approached him. "Your lodge doesn't just warm anymore, it guards." Wakenya looked up. "It breathes with intention now. It inhales when we sleep, exhales when we need to vanish." He showed them the bark funnel. "This is the next whisper." The people began fitting them to their smoke holes, and soon, even on the coldest nights, the village became a ghost warmed from within, unseen from without. The fire, once a beacon for both life and danger, had learned how to hide. And in that hiding, the people found a new kind of safety, not behind walls, not through weapons, but through wisdom laid into stone and earth, a fire that no longer cried out, only whispered. By the time Wakenya's hair turned gray, every lodge in the valley breathed. Children no longer learned how to fan smoke from their bedding. They learned how to dig trenches in a spiral pattern and place the stones by feel. The fire was no longer a thing to fear, but something to be spoken to, carefully, gently, with design. He never called himself a teacher, never raised his voice. But his lodge, now older than the boys who once laughed at it, still stood still warm in winter, still cool in summer, still silent when the wind came looking for weakness. One autumn day, a traveler from a distant forest arrived. He brought no weapons, only a satchel filled with drawings. Spirals, vents, fire chambers carved into clay, trench systems layered with shell and sand. "My people speak of a man who gave fire a way to rest." I said, "Are you him?" Wakenya only shook his head. "I gave nothing. I remembered." The traveler stayed 3 days and asked many questions. On the third morning, he sat with Wakenya beside the lodge. The frost still clung to the grass, but the ground beneath them was warm. "Why did no one else do it?" the traveler asked. "Why did no one think to put fire beneath the air?" Wakenya ran his fingers through the soil. "Because they thought fire belonged to the sky, but it doesn't." He patted the ground gently, as if waking something beneath the roots. "Fire belongs to the ground. That's where it rests. That's where it lingers. The sky only shows where it's going. The earth remembers where it's been." He stood slowly, bones creaking like old trees. "And if you build with memory," he said, "not just with hands, fire will never leave you." When he passed on, many winters later, quietly, with no pain, his lodge was not burned like the old ways dictated. The people preserved it, sealing the trench with ash and herbs, laying the stones just as he had, untouched. They called it the first breather. And they told the children, he didn't tame fire, he gave it away home. Other valleys began to build the same. Tribes carried the trench fire method to places where wind bit sharper and storms rolled harder. They changed the stones, the angles, the depths. But they all kept one thing, the breath. Even now, long after his name is forgotten in some places, his lodges remain, hidden in the land like bones of wisdom, still standing, still warm, still whispering. And in every lodge where a baby sleeps without coughing, where an elder lives through another cruel winter, where smoke leaves gently instead of clinging to the lungs, Wakenya's gift lives on, not as invention, but as memory. Because the fire he built wasn't just warmth, it was understanding, and the earth never forgot.